Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Lazy Girl's Guide to Podcasting. Now, for this episode and the next episode, so episodes 98 and 99, I think we're up to, which is just absolutely insane, I am going to be diving into the vault and re-releasing 2 episodes for you guys to listen to. And these are 2 episodes which, in my opinion, are absolutely brilliant, but they were released well over a year ago now, and as the podcast was only just starting to gather traction, they statistically just haven't done very, very well, these episodes. So I think that they are great. I think they have got some amazing goodness in them, which is why I'm going to release them for the next 2 episodes. Both of those episodes are going to be released today on Saturday, 3rd of August. I realise that I have not released an episode this week. I have just got so much going on at the moment in my personal life, which I will give you guys an update on that as soon as I can. It's just not something that I can be in a position to talk about at the moment, but everybody's fine, and that's what all you need to know at the moment is everybody's fine. But it's just taking up a lot of my time, this particular situation. It's taking up a lot of my brain power, a lot of my emotional power and strength. And that's why I haven't been as active on social media of late as you would normally see, particularly over on Twitter. I know I'm normally very active on Twitter, and I know that a lot of you have been a bit like, Verity, where have you disappeared to over the last, 4 or 5 weeks? It's not that I don't want to be there. It's not that I don't want to be showing up. But as I said, I've just got stuff going on, which I just need to focus on that at the moment. And I've just had to be incredibly tough with myself almost as to what it is that needs to be given priority. And unfortunately, the podcast has just not been it. So I apologize for being a little bit lackluster on social media. I know that a lot of you have reached out to me via email, DMs and what have you. I will get back to you. Absolutely promise you. I haven't disappeared. I'm still here. I've been reading your messages. I need to get back to a lot of you. So I will be doing that over the coming weeks. But for this episode that I am re-releasing, I'm re-releasing episode 43, Should I Quit My Podcast? I find that there are so many people in the podcasting space who maybe don't get the immediate success that they want for the podcast, or their marketing efforts or their content, it's just not reaching the people that they want it to reach. A whole load of reasons as to why people think about quitting their podcast. So in this episode, and I absolutely love this episode, we talk all about how you might have arrived at the decision to quit your podcast and what you should do before you actually go ahead with quitting. I look at some different strategies of things that you might want to do before you take the final decision to quit. And I also discuss that it's okay to quit your podcast if you want to. There's no shame in that. And I think, as I said, I think it's a great episode. I really hope you enjoy it. So here it is. This episode, we are going to be talking about should I quit my podcast? Because this is something which I feel at least once podcast go through this phase of thinking, should I quit my podcast? Should I just give up on it? For a whole variety of reasons. And I feel like there's not enough conversation around this. So in this episode, I just really wanted to bring light to that conversation and just unpick this thought process of should I quit my podcast? I realize this is a bit of an odd topic to cover as somebody who promotes people getting into podcasting, and I talk so much about launching podcasts and how to grow your podcast, all the rest of it. I realize this is a little bit of an ironic or juxtaposition topic for me to be talking about, but I'm excited to dive into it kind of regardless. I think it's going to be an interesting one. So the first thing I want to address, if you are thinking of quitting your podcast, is first of all, get rid of that sense of failure. Because if you do have a sense of failure, you need to get rid of it, because you have taken an idea for a podcast and actually created a podcast, you are already 100 steps ahead of somebody who has just sat for ages with the idea of the podcast. You have gone out, you've researched or I'm assuming anyway, you've researched your equipment, your tech, you've figured out how to do all the editing, hosting platforms, directories, all the rest of it, and you have got a podcast up and going. So first of all, if you do have a sense of failure, you need to get rid of that, because you've already created a podcast. You've been running a podcast no matter how long it's been going for. And that is huge. So you need to give yourself the credit there. But the next thing I want you to do is really consider why it is that you want to quit the podcast or your podcast in the first place. So let's dive into that a little bit of why do people quit podcasting or quit their podcast? And to me, I feel that the main reason why people kind of give up or quit, use whatever terminology you want, is because they are not seeing the success or the results that they want to immediately. Whatever that success or results might be, they're not seeing it quickly enough. Now, podcasting is a slow game. It really, really is. It takes time to build traction, and it takes time to get that kind of momentum with the listeners, with downloads and promotion and all the rest of it. So should you quit just because you're not seeing the traction that you want? Well, I think that kind of depends. I mean, if you're hell-bent on quitting, fine. But I think that if you are just not seeing the success that you want quickly enough, I think you first of all need to really think to yourself, well, how do I define success in the first place? Do I have a strategy for meeting whatever that term of success is? So I guess that then ties nicely into the second question of when should you quit a podcast? And to me, I think you should quit your podcast when you're no longer passionate about the topic. If you've just lost passion for the topic that you're talking about, your episodes are going to end up mediocre at best. And that's going to show, and that's going to switch off listeners as well. I mean, to me, it's really obvious when a host has lost passion for their topic and is just producing episodes for the sake of content creation. So I think that if you feel like you've got to a point where you are just creating content for the sake of it, that's probably a sign that you should possibly be looking at quitting your podcast. So how many people do quit a podcast? Well, on average, most people will quit their podcast before episode 8. So if you've made it to 8 episodes or more, congratulations, you've already beaten a statistic in the odds. It's estimated that around 44% of podcasts have 3 or fewer episodes. So, if you've got to 20 episodes, you've been doing this for 6 months on a weekly basis, and you're thinking this is not for me anymore, you've already done bloody well. You really, really have. And as I've already said, a lot of it is because people don't see the immediate success. But then I think also there's a group of people who don't necessarily envisage the amount of time that podcasting takes up in terms of recording, researching, editing, promoting. They say, I don't know who they are, people in the podcasting world say that you should be spending about 80% of the time of a podcast episode actually promoting it. So when you look at a podcast episode as a whole, you should only spend 20% of your time actually researching and recording and editing it. The other 80% of time, you need to be promoting that. I think it's also important to touch on what the average lifespan of a podcast is as well. And I had to do quite a bit of digging to actually find this statistic, but I found some stats that suggested that the approximation of or the average life of a podcast is 174 days, which is approximately 6 months. So I think 6 months, or to get to the 6-month mark, to try something out and figure out, hey, this isn't for me, I think that's good. I think that's a good time period. I mean, most people will have probation periods at work, which will last about 3 to 6 months. So I think 6 months is a good time for you to kind of start analyzing and thinking to yourself, is this really what I want to be doing? Is podcasting right for me there? But on that note, I have got 6 signs that it probably is time to quit your podcast. So the first one is you're no longer passionate. I've already covered that. So I said, if you're not passionate about what you are talking about, then you're just not going to produce the quality content. So on that note, you run out of quality content and you just feel like you are just producing content for the sake of it. Number 3, you just don't enjoy creating podcast content anymore. And that's absolutely fine. We all go into something, we try it out, we get fed up of it, we move on. If you are fed up and don't enjoy creating content for your podcast anymore, that's absolutely fine. Number 4 is if your podcast just doesn't fit in with your lifestyle anymore. And again, I think this is something that doesn't get mentioned an awful lot because life changes and things happen and family life happens and work life happens and we get sick and we get better again and stuff happens in the wider world. I get it. You know, life does not stay the same and our lives change. And sometimes you could just get to a point where podcasting just isn't fitting in with your life anymore. Number 5 is when you start to feel so overwhelmed by everything. Now, this one doesn't mean that you should necessarily quit straight away. It could be that you need to take a bit of a pause and you need to look at your workflow and potentially cut things out of your workflow or make sure that your workflow is more aligned, look at batch creating and what have you. But if you are getting to the point where the podcast is owning you as opposed to you owning the podcast, I would say that that is time to pause, take a think, step back and consider whether or not you want to still invest your time and energy into your podcast. And number 6 is that your gut is just telling you that it is time to move on with something else. And as I said, that is absolutely fine. We all try things, decide it's not for us, and then move on. And there is nothing wrong with deciding that podcasting was not for you or you did it as a project and now you just want to move on to something else. The other thing that I want you to consider when it comes to you thinking about quitting your podcast is actually flipping the question around a little bit. And rather, should I quit my podcast is actually, should I take a break? Because sometimes taking the break gives you time to analyze where you're at and really actually give you the thought processes that you can't really have when you're in the thick of a project. So I'm going to give you the example of my other podcast, which is the Confident CEO podcast. I'm just going to look at the calendar on the other side of the room, but I have not actually put out a new episode for that podcast since the beginning of July. And I'm now recording this. Well, we're like 3 days off starting September. So I have not put out a new episode for that podcast in quite a while. And the reason for that is because the Confident CEO podcast, we were continually putting out new content for a good 15 months. It was amazing. We got to thousands of downloads in the podcasting charts. Absolutely fantastic. I still have people, even though we haven't put out new content for that podcast in 2 months now, I still have pretty much on the daily people contact me asking to guest on that show, which is absolutely amazing and incredibly humbling. But I kind of got to the point after producing pretty much weekly content for that for 15 months. And I felt like I'd covered a lot of the topics that could be covered on that podcast. And instead of continuing to put out content, what I decided to do is take the summer off from it and just not think about the Confident CEO podcast at all. And then when September, October comes around, actually reevaluate, have a look back over the catalogue of the episodes that are currently there and decide what new, fresh conversations I can bring to that podcast, what kind of guests I want to bring in, whether I want to switch up the format a little bit, or whether or not I just completely walk away from that podcast. It doesn't mean I'm quitting it. What it means is that I've just kind of got to a point where I was like, I need to have a break from it because I can't currently see the wood for the trees. I have continually created podcast content for that podcast for a solid 15 months. And I was also, unlike this podcast where I tend to batch record a lot of things. So like I haven't recorded an episode for Lazy Girls Guide to Podcasting in about 5 weeks because of how I batch content my episodes. I wasn't doing that for the Confident CEO podcast. I was pretty much recording and then putting out and then recording and then publishing. So being on that cycle, I just found it a little bit challenging for me, hence why I'm having that break. And also hence why I've got a completely different format for creating content for this particular podcast. But to kind of summarize what we've gone through in this episode, what I really want to get across is if you are thinking of quitting your podcast, is there is no shame in that. And that is absolutely fine. It's your podcast at the end of the day. If you want to quit your podcast, that's fine. But what I would really suggest you do is rather than deciding outright, I'm quitting, I've had enough, I've walked away, unless your circumstances kind of take that decision out of your control, I would actually really urge you to take a step back and just consider to yourself, do I need a break from this? Do I need to do something else for a couple of weeks or a couple of months and then come back to it? And there is nothing wrong with taking a break, and you can still involve your audience, let them know on social media that you're taking a break and all the rest of it, engage with your community, because they might have feedback for you as well. They might be saying, oh yeah, do you know what? I was actually feeling that the last few episodes weren't as amazing as your earlier ones. And that could be giving you the indication that you do need to take a bit of a break, or you do need to relook at your content strategy. Equally, somebody might turn around to you and say, oh, I really thought that you'd be great doing a podcast on XYZ. Or do you know what? You might just think after you've taken that break, yeah, I'm so full of passion again. I actually want to go back to creating content for my podcast. Or you're like, no, actually, I've enjoyed the break and I want to completely walk away. But regardless of what your decision is, as long as it's the right decision for you as an individual, I'm going to give you permission to quit your podcast if you want to, which, as I said right at the beginning of this episode, might sound incredibly strange because, yeah, I'm all about launching podcasts and helping people, create more for their podcast. But sometimes we need permission to do things. So if you want to quit your podcast or you want to take a break from your podcast, I am giving you the permission to do that. So on that note, are you thinking of taking a break from your podcast? Have you taken a break from your podcast? And what was the result of that? I would love to know. If you're watching on YouTube, let me know in the comments below. If you're listening via the podcast, then you can contact me at VeritySongon on Twitter. That is where I hang out the most at the moment. I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this episode. And otherwise, I will see you next episode. Happy podcasting.